Welcome to KRQE's New Mexico News Insiders. Here's Gabrielle Burkhart and Chris McKee. Sponsored by New Mexico PBS.
We don't think about this often, but our topic today is tied to something that has a lot of trickle-down impact, with the potential to impact everyday people across New Mexico in a lot of ways through government representation, to funding, and a lot more.
So that impact comes by way of population and how it's measured by the census. A decline in population growth is a problem for nearly any state in the country. And the forecast for a decline in New Mexico's population was recently highlighted in a University of New Mexico study.
Yeah, so why should you care about these kinds of projections? How are they determined? Let's get straight to our guest to help answer some of those questions. That is UNM senior researcher and scientist, Dr. Jacqueline Miller. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Oh, happy to be here.
So, Dr. Miller, your title, I looked on the website, is also partly a demographer at the Geospatial and Population Studies Center for UNM, leading population and demographics analysis. Can you first tell us broadly, what does that mean you do exactly?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly think my mom still struggles to figure out what I do, so it's totally reasonable that people won't know. So basically, what I do is I try to figure out how many people are in New Mexico, but not just sort of the total, right? But rather how many people are in different areas, right? Different smaller tracts is really what we go down to, which is a sub-geography of counties. Roughly about 4,000 or so people in a tract, although it varied. But then also in terms of what that age breakdown is, what the sex breakdown is, what the race and ethnicity breakdown is within those different geographies. And this is used by the state for a lot of different purposes, planning, knowing how many people what you'll need for schools, right? Or how many the hospital needs, or police, or fire departments, right? We don't actually discuss those, how the funding within the state or how many people you might need for those different needs. That's done, more by the legislators and other groups. But we provide basically the foundation for those discussions and the decisions. Our numbers are also used by the Department of Health. So when you think about how many people are, maybe their mortality rate, like how many people have died from, COVID, for example, right? Something that's more recent in our memory. They need to know how many people there were in the first place, right? To think about what the rate could be, or if we want to think about birth rates, you need to know how many people there were of a certain age group to think about what the rate could be. And so those numbers are used for those purposes. Now, projections are a little different, right? Projections are about the future, and they're about understanding how we expect our population to change, both in terms of the age distribution, but also in terms of the total number of people. And that's used for longer term planning, right? So a lot of things that we do, if you're going to build a school, for example, it's not going to be built tomorrow. It's much longer than that, right? And you don't want to build a school if you're only going to need it for 2 years. So long-term planning requires a better sense of how the population is changing. And that is what the purpose of the projections are. And I think one of the things that's really important to think about when talking about projections, though, is that projections are one scenario, right? And for our projections, they're based on the sort of recent trends that we've observed, what we've observed in fertility, for example, how many babies people are having, what we've observed in terms of mortality, how likely someone is to die at any given age, right? And then also migration. And for that, we've used sort of a combination of migration patterns. So we kind of used an average, let's say, of the 2000s and the 2010s, because 2010s, we had a lot more out migration. And if anything changes, right, if there was a sudden shift in any of those, right, if suddenly some other virus hit and people were dying at a much younger age, that would change our mortality patterns, right? Or if some miracle drug happened and everyone was living to 150, that would change our mortality patterns as well, right? Yeah. There's also a lot that can happen that can change migration patterns. That's actually the biggest one. So so they're used, but they're based on a certain set of assumptions, and you can plan using that.
We wanted to ask you, statewide, one of the things from this study, New Mexico has an aging population. The study we're referencing states, quote, the number of New Mexicans aged 65 and older is expected to increase by over 200,000 people over the next 20 years. It's a rise of more than 28%. At the same time, the number of New Mexicans ages 85 and older will more than double over the next 20 years. Again, that's all from the study there. For context, how do these projections compare to other states or national numbers, and what do these projections tell us exactly?
The patterns of aging, that's really something we're seeing across the country, right? And actually in many Western countries, so not just the US, in that, their baby boomer generation, right, is a large generation, and they're aging. And so that group is large and they're getting older. And that's just sort of a natural process, right? But then there's a second piece to aging, and that's that people are having fewer children. And so you have a sort of a smaller young age group, right? But then you have this large older age group that's also getting older. And so New Mexico does tend to have a bit of a higher share of sort of the 65 plus than a lot of states, not the highest, but higher. But we're really not an outlier in that sense. It's something that the whole US is trying to work to understand how to manage, right? It's not necessarily bad, it's a change. And changes require sometimes a shift in how we do things or how we think about things.
Yeah. And that's also, I want to get to some of the other things in the study too, but just to focus a little bit more on one of the things you pointed out, this is also coupled with the fact that New Mexicans are having fewer children each year. So for example, in New Mexico's 0 to 24 population, that's expected to be around 550,000 people by 2040. This is from that research from UNM. That represents a decline of 20% over 20 years. So on a smaller scale, the kindergarten population at my daughter's school has gotten a lot smaller over the last year, which is something that I learned about, on the PTA there. And I was able to see just how it's already impacting the school with a decline in kindergarten enrollment. They already lost a teacher and they're worried about potentially losing more resources with a decline in enrollment overall, which I know a lot of the public schools across the country are dealing with. So it's an issue, that people hear about, we're facing maybe on small micro scales, but there's probably more than one factor to consider there. But just, the fact that there are fewer kids, it seems like, being born in the first place. Why do you think that is?
I don't think there's a clear answer of it is because of X, right? But the trends in fertility have been declining for some time, right? In the 90s and early 2000s, it was largely driven by a drop in teen pregnancy, which I think most people would say is probably a pretty good thing, right? But there was also some declines in people who were in their 20s, and in unintentional births. Also, if you don't want to get pregnant, then it's probably good if you don't, right? But then the recession hit, and then we saw this steep drop. And it wasn't just sort of this one-time thing. It kept happening, right? So if it was only the recession, then we would have seen a rebound post, after a few years, right? But we didn't. It's just continued to decline. And so, it's very common. Research has shown this over and over again. You see it throughout history. When there is some economic uncertainty or some shock, you tend to see declines in fertility, right? And that's really logical. We wonder how much behavior is logical. An economist would tell you that people do act in rational ways. I'm not an economist though, but but it makes sense, right? If you don't know if you're going to have a job, you probably don't really want to have a child, right? And we see that play out in recessions across the last century, probably before that, but I don't think our numbers were great. So, we see this drop in fertility, and we saw especially large drops among people who are in their 20s, right? Which is, so you can imagine if you're entering the workforce and and a recession hits, it's going to be a lot harder to say, oh, wait, I'm struggling to find a job. You're probably going to be more likely to say, oh, I'm not going to have a child, or I'm not going to start having children yet, right? And it took a lot longer for people who were kind of entering the workforce at that period with the recession to sort of get on their feet. In fact, you hear a lot in the news still about how hard, millennial generation, which was honestly, they were 12 to 27 in 2008. They're currently 28 to 43 is the millennial generation. So solidly in like a childbearing age group. But you hear a lot about how much this generation struggles with being able to afford a house, for example, right? And kind of maintain these careers. And so if you have this high level of uncertainty financially, you're less likely to have a child. You also saw sort of in this post-recession period a larger drop in fertility among Hispanic women. In part, it was sort of this trend kind of towards sort of the more global fertility patterns, right? So that might be more of an assimilation, or it might be choice or concerns about economics, but you're seeing this pattern. And so that actually is probably part of the reason New Mexico has seen as much of a drop as they have, because New Mexico has a higher proportion of Hispanics. There's also some research that shows that people are more likely to sort of start a family, like have their first child when they're near family. And, for some people in New Mexico, there's a lot of family communities, right? People who are close to their family, but there's also people who aren't, right? There's research showing that being close to family, like a parent or a sibling, you're more likely than to have a child. But there's less research sort of on all these pieces together. But if you think about it historically, child rearing was much more of a community activity, right? You kind of had your village, whether it was family or neighbors or friends, kind of helped out. And now you're seeing a lot less of this, right? And it might be that you're not physically near your family, right? That you had to move for a job opportunity. I think this happens a lot in the rural parts of the state, where people have to sort of weigh this being close to family versus lack of maybe jobs and economic opportunities, right? Not all rural areas of the state, but some, right? And then, or maybe people leave the state because of opportunities, or they come to the state for an opportunity, but then they don't have family nearby. But there's also the people who do have family nearby, but their family can't really help them, whether it's because of health reasons or maybe because they are all working full time and there's only so much help they can give, right? And so I think people are raising kids in a lot more of a silo now than they used to. And that is hard, it's really hard. And so, I suspect that this lack of a village, parenting village in a way, also contributes to this sort of decline in fertility. Though I think there needs to be a lot more on that, right? This is partially my observations, my knowledge of research, but it's also sort of not explored as much as I think it needs to be.
Yeah. Can you expand on some of the implications of a declining birth rate and an aging population? What does it ultimately mean for New Mexico?
When you have a population that's older, you have fewer people who are working, right? People tend to retire, if they're economically comfortable, they'll retire when they have enough money to retire, when they can just retire, right, financially. But other people will retire because they physically can't do their job anymore, right? Or other health concerns, right? And so you have people who are leaving, and then you do have older people who will also still be working if they can and if they want to or if they need to, right? But you have there's a smaller portion of that population that works for whichever reason. And so when you have an older and older population, you have fewer and fewer people who are in the workforce as a share of the population, right? And that has several implications. One is, well, on the very foundational sort of sense, is there's less of a tax basis, right? If we have income taxes, you have less of a basis in that for the various services that the state needs to provide. And then also on a national level, right, there's fewer people contributing to Social Security and Medicare and things of that nature. But on a more sort of day-to-day level, you have fewer people who are able to provide services, right? There are fewer people who are nurses. There are fewer people who are doctors. There are fewer people who are teachers. But at the same time, you need more doctors and you need more nurses because as people get older, they have more healthcare needs, right? So there's this lack of, it's unbalanced.
The supply and demand is unbalanced, yeah.
Right. And so it creates challenges. Now, I'm hesitant always to say that, that somehow we have to suddenly change it so that the balance is more even. I think, there are a lot of smart people out there, and I think really it's more of a matter of coming up with creative solutions. Although, maybe they'll come up with some solution where there's not a lack of balance. But it's going to require a lot of thinking and planning of how to address the changes. Because it's not, as we were talking about earlier, it's not limited to New Mexico. So it's not that, New Mexico has all the people who are retirees and other states have all the younger people. In fact, other states also have a decline in their fertility. And so that's not, that's really not where the solution lies.
We'll be right back with more of the New Mexico News Insiders.
Hi, I'm Monica Wicki, host of New Mexico Living. This episode of New Mexico News Insiders is sponsored by New Mexico PBS. If you enjoy New Mexico News Insiders, check out New Mexico in Focus, a great source for insights about what's happening in our state. Catch their podcast and videos at nmpbs.org or stream it anytime, anywhere on the free PBS app. Now, let's continue to New Mexico News Insiders.
Let's talk about migration patterns as well, because I know that also plays a factor in your overall research. According to the U.S. Census, since 2020, New Mexico has seen a net loss of about 6,000 people who've moved to other states. The study says since 2012, domestic migration has been negative, meaning that more U.S. residents move out of New Mexico than into New Mexico each year. So can you tell us a little bit more about that piece of data and what you found?
Yeah, so New Mexico does tend to have more out migration of domestic, of U.S. citizens, basically. And so that is something we see in our projections. The total loss from 2020 to now, they use different approaches than us, and I don't fully agree that we fully have lost all that population but it's 6,000 people. Honestly, that could be noise. That's not that much when you think of the whole population. But in terms of our patterns over the last, since 2010, we have seen this pattern where we have a lot more negative domestic migration. And in fact, if we did not have international migration in the last decade, we would have lost population rather than having gained population. New Mexico kind of has to decide, and this isn't really for me to decide, but New Mexico has to decide whether that's the politicians or the people and talking to their politicians of what New Mexico wants, right? Does New Mexico want to keep the population on the smaller side? Does it want growth, right? There are benefits to growth, but there are also downsides to growth. And that's going to impact sort of how New Mexico approaches things, because if we continue to lose population, then the change in these population dynamics will be more extreme. In that, a lot of times when people are moving, they're younger, and if younger people leave, then there's fewer births, right? And so that adds to this pattern where you see, so there's the amount of children, we were talking about fertility, there's the amount of children each person has, but then there's the children on the population level, right? And if you have fewer people who are of childbearing age, you will have fewer children regardless, right? And so, so if New Mexico wants growth, then they need to look at migration. And really, the place that New Mexico tends to grow in terms of migration is from international migration. That's where we get our positive migration.
We also know some of the areas that are projected to see rapid declines in population are really the rural parts of New Mexico, and there are many rural parts, this is being the fifth largest state geographically in the U.S., so if you think about it, it makes sense when you have a shifting population especially when you see that sort of growth in urban areas that people would move out of the more rural ones. So with that, you may lose resources as well in rural communities. There are fewer job opportunities or things to keep younger people around in those rural areas. We are already seeing that in some rural communities, right? Here in New Mexico, can you maybe give us some examples of that? And does it look like that trend will continue?
In New Mexico, we do see the biggest declines in rural communities or in rural counties specifically. Part of it is that many of these counties are older, right? And so we were just talking about sort of that, how, older people they typically do not have that many children, like, right? They're done, right? They're done with that process. So they're not adding to the population in terms of through fertility. But people who are older also have a higher chance of dying, like in the near future, right? If you are 80 years old, you are more likely to pass away than if you are 10, right? And so if you have a population that is mostly over 65, you're going to experience more deaths, and that's just sort of the natural pattern of things. And so in a lot of these counties, you see, populations where the average age is around 50 years old, and that's, for an average is pretty high. And so we do see really big declines in places like, Tobacco, which actually does tend to have a slightly younger population, but it's just very small population and rural, and, Hidalgo and Mora County, like these places tend to see pretty big declines. Interesting, and I don't really know why this is, but Catron County, which tends to be much older, from our estimates, does look like it's actually added some population in the last couple of years, which we wouldn't have expected. And so, I don't know if that's more people wanting to retire there or what the scenario is, but that's an interesting situation. Places where we've seen a lot of gains tend to be younger. They do tend to be bigger. In our projections, I mentioned before, it's based on a set of assumptions, right? So if we look at the patterns we've seen over the last 20 years or so, then we expect places like Sandoval and Eddy and Lee County to grow. But we're already seeing Eddy and Lee County actually to sort of shift in that way, where in our estimates, we're not seeing them growing so much since 2020. And my understanding of this from talking to colleagues at, Bieber, who are more economists, is that there's, like, while the oil industry produces a lot of, it's very productive, they've used technologies that require fewer people to do that. And so the population has not grown despite the oil growing. And in fact, we've seen some declines in those populations in the last couple of years. So that's sort of an example of where there could be this shift where the trends don't continue as we've seen. Now, Eddy and Lee County could reverse that. Something could happen. I project this based on current trends. I do not have a crystal ball.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another factor that your study pointed out is that New Mexico, is not alone in having an aging population, that about 20 states are also seeing more deaths than births each year. How set are these trends in your view as a researcher in the long term? Like, is there, for example, room for that birth rate to shift?
It is unlikely unless there's some major change. Unless New Mexico's population becomes younger through migration, we're not going to experience more births than deaths. Or it's very unlikely, okay, right? I can't say completely. There could be some major change that leads to people having lots of babies, but it's unlikely. And I say this in part because if you look at both trends within the country, but also at other Western countries, we actually have a long way that we can still drop. The US has been dropping, but we're kind of above a lot of the other Western countries. We haven't dropped as much as other countries have. And so it suggests that we actually could keep dropping, especially when you look at the fact that certain, like I mentioned before, the Hispanic population has dropped in its fertility more than other groups. And if we continue to see this sort of convergence where people are kind of moving towards, the lower fertility that you see among sort of Asian and white women, then you'll continue to see a decline in births, and deaths are not likely to decrease, right? Deaths continue to increase if people are aging. And unless there's some major change in our life expectancy, then those are probably not going to change either. The main thing that has a decent chance of impacting fertility is a change in the composition of our state, right? And so if you have more people who are of childbearing age, then you could have more children, but only because there's more people, not necessarily because they're having more children individually.
I think we've talked a little bit about how, growing population is also critical for the economic growth of any state. When it comes to housing, healthcare, schools, and more, that's key there. What is your view on the economic impact that New Mexico could see over the next decade, 20, 30 years?
So I am not an economist, right?
Right.
But you lay the foundation for economists.
That's right.
So I do know that, so BEBER, for example, does economic forecasts. So BEBER is another unit within UNM. They do economic forecasts for the state of New Mexico in different areas. And they do use our estimates and our projections in their models. But they are, but I don't tell them what to do with them. They just do something, right? And I mean, I agree with you in that there is an impact, the population does impact sort of how economic growth could happen, but I don't know whether or not it's a requirement. I know it's something we typically associate, but is there other creative ways to have economic growth that doesn't require, a huge growth in population? I don't know. This is not me saying there is. I really don't know. I think that there are things that can prevent economic growth, right? I think, for example, education, right? If you don't have a good education system, then you're going to struggle with having the base for that. There is, innovation is important for economic growth. Could that come from our current population, or is it something that we need outside ideas for? I think either one is a possibility. So that's really something that, well, it's probably more suited for economists, but I also think that a level of creativity is needed, really, to think about different ways of approaching things, right? There's been times of demographic shifts in the past. Now, in the most recent past, those demographic shifts have always been to sort of more people, right? But they have been shifts where suddenly things were different and people had to change how things were done. Right? Like, for example, after World War II, there was a large baby boom, obviously, but there was also a large number of women who were now widowed, right? And the, government and societies needed to think about how to work on a society that has shifted in that way. And in the same way, like we're dealing with a shift, and people, I think, just need to think about creative ways of dealing with this shift.
We recently asked our political analysts during our Election Day episode how this projection about a declining population could impact even the political landscape. The idea that New Mexico could even lose a congressional seat, for example. I know you're not a, politician or a policy analyst or anything like that, but do you have any thoughts about that? Do people come to you and have those types of conversations as well?
So that's always going to be a concern. I think at least for 2020, we weren't really concerned about losing a seat because we knew that the amount we'd have to drop was fairly significant, right? I have not looked at what numbers you would expect for 2030, but congressional seats are distributed proportionally based on populations across the country. And so there always is a chance that something's lost. But even if we don't lose one, right, others are gaining or could gain, right? And so we still can lose our sort of relative influence. And Mexico already has very, few delegates relative to other states, so I do think as a state, that is concerning. We already don't have the largest representation.
Yeah, very large state geographically, as we said, but only 5 representatives in Congress, if you count the 2 senators and 3 House reps. Of course, we know that these numbers are projections based on data sets. They're not set in stone necessarily. But what do you see as one of the most unpredictable shifts that could change the population trajectory for New Mexico?
I mean, I think without a doubt, it's going to be really about international migration. And actually, we see this in the national projections. So the Census Bureau did national projections, and sort of they had sort of different levels of migration, and their middle level of migration sees population starting to decline around like 2080. But in a situation where there's no immigration, not in or out, just no immigration, the population starts declining in 2024, which is this year. And so we see a very similar thing in New Mexico. We were just talking a moment ago about how we have out migration for domestic US citizens, but we have positive international migration, or at least we did in the last decade. And so changes to international migration are the thing is sort of the wild card, really, because it's completely dependent on policies that we don't really have much say in. Our 5 representatives, right, the representatives of the House and the Senate have some say, right? But beyond that, we don't have a ton of say. Those are federal policies. And so it is a wild card because we don't know what will happen, right? We can have more migration, we can have less, and it likely will fluctuate, right? Sometimes there's going to be higher, sometimes there's going to be lower. But that's what's really going to have the biggest impact on how things change in the near future, but also sort of in the long term of these projections.
Doing this research, do you see any changes that policymakers in the state or local entities can, make to help shift the scene here in the long run? I'm thinking things that could potentially keep young people in the state, because I know that's something we've heard a lot about, I think, from policymakers is making New Mexico into a place where children want to stay.
That kind of question, I think, is much more about my personal opinions as opposed to, the projections themselves. As an individual, right, who has young kids, I think one of the things that is really important is, education. I think we don't have a very good as a whole, right? The state is not considered to have a very good education system. And even though you can find schools where you're like, oh, this is actually good, or you can do things, right? Mm-hmm. From people on the outside, they just look at the rankings and they think, well, I'm not going to move to New Mexico, right?
Yeah.
Right. So you have two things there. You have keeping people, right? And you have potentially attracting people if that's what New Mexico decides it wants to do. And so, yeah, I do think that education is a big piece when you're talking about where somebody wants to raise their kids and their family. I think, early on in the conversation I was mentioning how, in addition to sort of economic uncertainty, I think that the lack of a village also does contribute to sort of lower fertility. And so people might move to where their families are, but they also might not have family who can help. And so I think sometimes making parenting easier in different ways could help. But I should say that there's very little, you can make things easier and you can try to keep people here and you can try to encourage people to move here. But in terms of impacting actual fertility, very few policies have actually had a strong impact on that. There's been policies throughout the world trying to impact fertility because the US is not the only country that's worked on this. And things like paying people more money, right, or tax credits, those don't typically have an impact on fertility. The few places that have seen, in terms of these large studies, the few things that have had an impact on fertility tend to be things that are much more comprehensive, that make parenting easier, but also that aren't pushing a certain belief of how you should parent. So policies that allow for, if they're going to have a credit, it doesn't matter if you're working or not working, or parenting, or doesn't force a mother to be the one who stays home for like a parental leave rather than the father, right? Like it could be either. So it gives families flexibility to make their choices, but that is pretty comprehensive. And those are really hard to do, right? Like that's not something the state usually can do by itself. But in terms of impacting fertility directly, most policies have not had much of an impact.
We'll be right back with more on New Mexico News Insiders.
Hi, I'm Logan Rader, host of New Mexico Living. New Mexico News Insiders is sponsored by New Mexico PBS.
If you like New Mexico News Insiders, learn more about New Mexico in Focus, a weekly hour-long show analyzing decisions impacting New Mexico statewide. Stream it anytime, anywhere. Visit nmpbs.org and follow them on all social media platforms.
Now back to New Mexico News Insiders.
Was there anything else that we're missing that you'd like to add about your research, or you want people to better understand about your research?
And I think I've made comments or allusions to this throughout this talk, but I think what I really want people to do with these projections is to take them and say, okay, this is the path we are on right now. Things can change, and to think about do you want them to change? How do you want them to change? And if you want them to change, then start sort of doing the things that you might need to do, whether that's talking to the politicians, your representatives, or talking to community leaders to sort of impact what you want. But if you aren't concerned about necessarily changing our trajectory, then I'd like to see community organizers, leaders, businesses thinking about ways to address these changes so that we aren't, so we're not necessarily struggling, right? Like, creating solutions that make it so that it's easier, whether that's making it easier for people to stay in the workforce when they're older, or maybe it's making it easier for them to get services through some, a better transportation system. I'm not sure. For example, a transportation system is something that could help, right? If somebody isn't able to drive. So thinking creatively about what we might need to be a better place given these changes, right? For the community that we do have.
Well, Dr. Miller, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your insight and research into this topic.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Again, thanks to Dr. Jacqueline Miller, a UNM senior researcher and scientist, for leading us through this conversation about population effects in New Mexico. A great topic to jump off to after we had that short conversation about possible representation changes in New Mexico related to politics. There's interesting research behind how this could all play out.
And like she said, she's not a policymaker, but she definitely lays the foundation for all the policymakers with this research. And we'll link to it in our show notes if you guys want to read more about it, because there's a lot of interesting data sets. And yeah, some of it you might think, oh, well, that makes sense. It's common sense, but a lot to think about. If you want to, raise a family here. We're young parents, so
exactly. I know some of the things she was saying.
I felt like I was seeing a little bit.
Yeah,
and
exactly. Speaking directly to us.
I'm missing my village.
Yeah, I hear that.
I hear that.
Very, very important to have a village around to help raise kids for sure. Yeah. So, we should also note that if you're watching this on Fox New Mexico, this has been an abbreviated version of the conversation. The whole conversation is on krqe.com. Podcast channel, and also the YouTube page, youtube.com/krqe.
All right. Well, if you guys have any story ideas or someone you'd like to hear from on our podcast, feel free to reach out. I'm Gabrielle.Burkhart@krqe.com via email, and gburknm on social media.
And I'm at Chris McKee TV, also chris.mckee@krqe.com. Thanks for watching and listening.